is hard-pressed in these times of coronavirus, as well as the ubiquitous protest movement against racism in the United States. Aaron Kalman, the head of the Israel US Relations Department at the Ruderman Foundation, said that it was a time of concern of growing anti-Semitism in America. He told us that his foundation helped translate in Hebrew a book about the Jewish experience in the United States, which would help Israelis understand American Jewry better.
It's overwhelming. There are a lot of protests, a lot of demonstrations, and as you mentioned in the question, also some violence. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the air, together with a hope that is, first of all, that where justice is needed, justice be seen and happen. And the second one is a hope that this doesn't hurt the Jewish community, because unfortunately throughout history, we have seen times where all sorts of demonstrations and protests end up turning and hurting Jews. We know that in the past few months with the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis, and even before that, anti-Semitism in the United States has been on the rise. We have seen in the recent years things like shootings at synagogues both in Pittsburgh and Poway, which were unthinkable not long ago. And since then, of course, there have been other attacks, graffiti on synagogues, desecration of cemeteries, all sorts of things. And only, a few days ago, I saw on the social networks videos from demonstrations of white supremacists and neo-Nazis with flags marching proudly with Nazi emblems and symbolism. So, like I said, I think the Jewish community is hoping for two things. One, that justice happen where it needs to happen, and we all know that there are faults which need to be repaired, and America does have some racism which needs to be uprooted. And at the same time, a hope that the Jewish community comes through without becoming a target, as can happen, and we hope doesn't.
Now, the Jewish community in the United States is a generally liberal community. How is it being engaged in all this unrest?
So, like you said, it's a generally a liberal community. We know voting patterns for the past 60 years show that it votes overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party and identifies with that. I know we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, but the book we just translated, World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe, is a book about immigrants and the Jewish migration to the United States, and that DNA of being a minority immigrant community is still very much part of the Jewish American community's identity. And I think that goes back to what I said, which is we know the famous pictures from the 60s and 70s, the civil rights movement, where Martin Luther King was marching hand in hand with Rabbi Abraham Yoshua Heschel throughout the streets. And that alliance isn't as strong as it was, and some people would say it's non-existent maybe, but there's still an identity that the Jewish community has that sees minorities struggling for equal rights and for recognition, which they support.
There's this schism between the U.S. Jewry and Israel, and the Ruderman Foundation, I think you helped put out a book called World of Our Fathers. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, so there's a gap between Israel and the American Jewish community, which is a lot of times based on lack of knowledge from both sides. And for the past decade, the Ruderman Family Foundation has worked with Israelis to strengthen Israelis' understanding of the American Jewish community, its history, its life, its challenges and its successes. And one of the projects which we've been doing for the past few years is translating masterpieces and classic books from English to Hebrew, books that are about the American Jewish community. And the book that was now translated, and we're happy to release, with partnership, I need to mention two partners here, the University of Haifa and Ben-Gurion University, who we are carrying out all this project with, is a book called World of Our Fathers. It was written originally in the 70s by Irving Howe, and it's considered a monumental work about the Jewish immigration from Europe to America, specifically to New York and the Lower East Side at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. It's a book which describes many of the challenges and things which still identify the Jewish community today. I mentioned before, being a community of immigrants, questions of tradition versus modernism, of people having to decide whether they keep observing Shabbat and holidays or working because they needed to provide for their families. It has a lot of very interesting things about them, how the communal institutions came to be, these institutions and organizations that continue to run one way or another with the American Jewish community until today. And we are very happy to make this book available in Hebrew. We think that a book that was published that is so important. And just to give it a context, when it was released in 1976, it won the National Book Award for History that year. Not a Jewish award, but the American award for the National Book Award. And Israelis don't know these stories, and it's another story in the series of books we're translating. Again, to make it accessible to the Israeli public, to Hebrew speakers, to Hebrew readers, and hopefully bring more understanding of the American Jewish community to the Israelis.
Well, as you said, it was written almost 50 years ago. How would you write the next chapter if it was written today?
That's a very good question, and I'm happy to say that the next book, which is being translated, was finished less than 2 years ago. So in a sense, that is the next chapter. I'm not going to give a spoiler and say which one it is, but it's much more current affairs as opposed to history. But I think that when I look at the project which we at the Ruderman Family Foundation are dealing with, of bridging this gap between the knowledge of Israelis, of the American Jewish community, and everything else associated with this, we need to bring everything. We need to talk about today's challenges and today's successes, but also know our roots. At the end of the day, if we don't understand where the American Jewish community is coming from, who they are, what they're doing, why they think and behave like they do today, just as much as they study Israel. They study Israeli history, they study Zionist history. We need to study them a little bit. And I think that in that sense, this book does a very good job of bringing that founding story that happened 100 years ago, but that laid the groundwork for the community we know today.
Well, we see the government of Israel also looks like it's trying to make steps. They appointed a full-time diaspora affairs minister, Omer Yankelevich, who had a video conference just last night with the leaders of the American Jewish community, together with the President Rivlin. So there are some steps being made here. My question is, is this a two-way street?
I think so. I think that there are a lot of projects, both at the government level and civil society, various organizations on both sides. I think we need to remember that it's not a symmetric relationship. Israel has an elected government. The American Jewish community does not. It has communal institutions. But I think that yesterday's video conference, which you said, included President Rivlin, Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi, Minister of Diaspora Affairs Omer Yankelevich, and spoke to about a dozen leaders of various Jewish organizations from across the United States, is an important step forward. We see these things happening occasionally. I think we can hope that they become more systematic, that all the voices of the various communities are present at the table, that it's not only the traditional organizations, but also ones representing younger Jews, those who are somewhat unaffiliated and aren't always part of the conversation, and that it doesn't only happen when there are crises, but that it happens during our routine life daily schedule, because at the end of the day, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, not only when there's anti-Semitism or when there's the coronavirus, but it's also on an ongoing basis, and we need to have those conversations on an ongoing basis.
Aaron Kalman of the Ruderman Foundation. Coming up later in the broadcast.